I'm hearing a lot about interests versus values, and I still, and it's not your fault, Matthew, because I'm constantly vexed by this when I'm watching the news and I'm attending conferences like this. What is the main interest of the United States with Saudi Arabia and the UAE that we need to protect so much that we are willing to overlook our democratic values, whether it be the forced detentions, the torture, the treatment of migrant workers, the 9/11 hijackers, the lobbying organization machinery in this country that's influencing our members of Congress. Go on, the Wahhabism being exported in complete opposition to what we're trying to do in the region. Tell me what that interest is. Like, convince me that we need to keep this alliance going so much that we are willing to violate our own core principles as America.
I would say that it's not so much an issue of human rights violations here, but an adherence to what we consider important in an ally, and that is respect for the law, respect for the treaties that they've signed. Because if we turn a blind eye to that because we're worried about nuclear Iran, we're going to see more and more of this rogue behavior that is going to lead to a severe escalation where citizens of the United States are simply not safe.
Democrats and a significant number of Republicans hear that argument. They hear, okay, the reason we have to tolerate all of this rogue behavior from the UAE and from Saudi Arabia is because we need to check Iran, and if we don't do this, Iran will run amok. And unsaid in that, and sometimes said in that, is that the reason we need to do this is because it's in Israel's interest in the region there. And then they say, well, okay, but Saudi Arabia and the UAE are running amok. So if the worst that's going to happen is that Iran is going to run amok, why don't we actually just sit down with Iran, negotiate a nuclear treaty?
Saudi and the UAE obviously want the relationship with the United States and the United Kingdom more than we actually need it from them. We would find a solution no matter what. And that's no reason or justification for continuing to allow them to act in this manner. It's definitely against US interests that we have an ally that is acting in a way that is not congruent with what we want in an ally. And we have to stand up for that we can have our interests in the Middle East, but also the knowledge from these countries that this behavior is not acceptable. And they will listen. They have commercial interests. We have Virgin and Richard Branson actually pulling out commercially of Saudi. Because of the Khashoggi killing, I mean, there's many ways to prove a point, and there's many ways that can be done so either diplomatically or through commercial pressures. And I don't think one cancels the other. I think we can have both.
Okay, let's get to some questions. Do you believe the CIA's conclusion that MBS ordered the killing of Khashoggi, and I'm going to add, what should we do about it, if you believe it?
Absolutely. There's no doubt whatsoever in my experience that of course he knew about it. There's no way that any intelligence agents or security advisors of his or agents would act without his direct instruction. And the same can be said from the UAE and my experience there with tortures that have been instructed at the highest levels. It would be impossible for him not to be directly involved. I think with Khashoggi, certainly, already, obviously, they've suffered commercial and public relations issues, and I don't think that we can accept that this behavior is okay unsanctioned, whether that's through diplomatic conversations or some other review of the alliance, or even absolutely talking about it in public and not saying that it's okay for this to happen. I don't want to walk into an embassy one day and be chopped up to little pieces and no one cares because, well, they're our friend. I mean, if MBS continues to, I mean, there has to be something very serious done about it, very public, and preferably he would be moved aside in power. I think it's not a humanitarian issue so much as a legal issue. And if this goes without some sort of solution, it's just going to extend and escalate. And then soon, we'll have Saudi picking people off the streets in the United States. And it sets an example to countries like the UAE and other Middle Eastern countries that this behaviour is tolerated, if not condoned, by the United States. With their growing influence in the US and the UK, I don't think we should just be turning a blind eye to, oh, well, that's the Arabs and that's how they do it.
And not only that, but the influence of Yemen in Washington is nil. And as a result, you can see what's happening to that country. And Iran, because of our relationship with them, doesn't spread money all over Washington. And as a result, we get this tilted policy. I do want to add one thing quickly on that. And I reported on this, I think, in 2015. When the Houthis entered the capital, the U.S. had intelligence intercepts at the time that revealed that the Iranians were telling them not to go forward. They said, this is a mistake. Do not do this. You're in a strong negotiating position. Just try to finish up your negotiations here. You don't need to turn this into a violent situation. They went anyway. The Houthis have their own agency. Iran has been happy at times, certainly, to help inflame the situation because it's clearly having a huge draining effect on Saudi Arabia. But the notion that Iran is taking over this area is just false.
Okay, let's get to some more questions. This one is from Katerina Metic. Ryan mentioned that the agenda of the New Democrats included using human rights violations as a means to push for their goals. Can you all speak about how we can shed some light on cases like Jamal's and other human rights violations and the role of the media to help facilitate change?
I mean, in my experience over the past 10 years, cases that haven't been raised to the media, that haven't been spoken about, that haven't been televised, in those cases, the people are still in jail, or they're still suffering human rights abuses. The UAE in particular, and other Middle Eastern countries, have not responded to polite requests. They've not responded to their legal system because, frankly, it's in shambles anyway. There is no due process, there's no justice, there's no ability to defend yourself with evidence at trial. As we saw with Matthew Hedges, the trial lasted 5 minutes and he was found guilty of espionage. And that sentence will follow him around for the rest of his life. When he, for example, enters a country, he's going to have to say, yes, I was convicted of being a spy. In times where I've represented clients in particular, over the past 12 to 24 months even, we've seen people facing years in prison. Some have been convicted and jailed. As soon as I've taken it to press and as soon as I've got the spotlight on it, the royals have intervened and that's facilitated their release, which just shows how lawless the system is over there. It shouldn't be possible for a ruler to intervene in a case just because it's been in press. What about the people who can't get press? Their case isn't that interesting to media, for example, or they're of another nationality, for example. India are less likely to care about one particular person because their population's so large. So it's almost terrifying that your only way to get out of injustice and imprisonment is to use the media. But it's just, I mean, it's fantastic that the media has actually learned this in the UK to the point where they feel like they're human rights activists now. They're calling me saying, do you have any more cases that we can get people free? And I mean, that's so concerning for the Middle East in general, but that's the role the media plays. More so, the media plays more of a role in facilitating the release of prisoners than the government does.
We have a question from Adele Nazarian. Human rights includes the right to privacy. How should we think about this right in our digital era, when states have so many more tools now at their disposal to violate our privacy? And I would just tack on to that some of the stories about, you know, Twitter trolls, in particular in Saudi Arabia, tracking social media accounts and punishing or targeting people for what they tweet or don't tweet.
I see in the UAE this is a huge problem with the implementation of the 2015 cybercrime laws that criminalise practically anything you can imagine. They have a telecoms regulatory authority that literally scours Facebook and Twitter looking for things that they convict people on. In some cases I've dealt with, this has included something like sharing a fundraiser from, let's say a fox hunting charity. A friend of mine, actually, I'd known him for 7 years before he was convicted there. He had shared a charity on Facebook that was raising money for Afghani children to pay for blankets. He was arrested. It was only after a 3-week media campaign that he was actually released. Otherwise, he would have faced 3 years in prison. The other issue with that is that if you have an enemy or a frenemy or someone who doesn't like you, someone you've upset, they can go onto Twitter, go onto Facebook, have a look at everything that you've posted over the past several years and find something and report you. Once they report you, the regulation authority has the obligation to follow up and convict you. And with convictions basically automatic, it's been a real problem. My colleague himself spent 4 months in prison over Twitter abuse before being finally acquitted due to media. But I mean, that includes saying anything defamatory, as I said, the weather, defamatory against the government, anything. The expats in the UAE were actually warned in the national newspaper, do not say anything about this Princess Latifa case. If you do, you will face imprisonment for lengthy periods of time. In my experience, journalists there have been extremely cautious about what they share, what they post, and most of them are extremely happy to finally leave the UAE where they actually have the ability to speak freely.
On the other side, she talked about the consequences of public posts, but to your question about private ones, it's a terrifying question because the cyber sleuthing abilities of the UAE and Israel are extraordinary at this point, and it is, it's been shown that they're willing to exploit these capabilities against adversaries, rivals, or non-supporters in ways that are going to change the way that we can communicate. And it's something that at The Intercept we take extremely seriously, and the organization that owns us has invested heavily in encryption and in other forms of data protection, but it's a constant arms race. The kind of norms around it have been completely broken, so it's now just a technological contest.
Right, and our own government here in the United States has hardly been innocent in that.
No, our government has been the one that has led the way on it.
And The Intercept has done lots of great work in investigative journalism in that area. This one is to Radha. The influence of Saudi Arabia and the UAE have in the US is a result of their lobbying and PR and money they give to think tanks, etc. How do others counter that power? Do any others, including Qatar, understand how to compete with their influence here in the United States?
Interesting question. I think it's all quite new to the opposition to this extreme lobbying, and that we are behind the 8 ball on that. The private sector, as I said, with Virgin pulling out of Saudi, are leading the way, but at the same time we have the UAE and Saudi really heavily promoting in racing, in the commercial sector. They're donating to education, to even churches, and buying up most of the property in London. It's hard to compete with that, but the way that we have been doing it, and I think quite successfully, and with even more success as we go on, is raising these issues to the press, which has a direct impact on investment and on tourism in the country, to the point where we've recently had the government of an emirate in the UAE for the first time approach us and say, okay, I think it's time that we had a conversation. What can we do to change? What can we do to stop you talking about us? And I mean, that's a wonderful step, because for at least 8 years I have approached the governments of different emirates in the UAE and asked them to have that conversation. And I've obviously been met with the silent treatment. in other Emirates, they have responded simply by releasing whoever I'm talking about at that time, but it's great to see one of the Emirates in particular actually looking to make those improvements, to step up and become, you know, the modern location that they market themselves as being. And I think that competition also is against the other Emirates in the UAE, and they do want to compete against them. So I think continuing to raise it in the media, to continuing at think tanks, in policy, with government officials, I think that's the way that ultimately leads to change.